The needle froze above a tiny hem, the sewing machine's motor a tired purr in the cramped room. Outside the single window, winter in the city had stolen color from the alley. Faded laundry hung like tired flags, the streetlight buzzed, and the neon sign of a bakery threw a thin gold line across the floor. Claire's hands moved on instinct, coaxing stubborn fabric into place. Thread dust clung to her fingertips like a second skin. On the shirt beside her, a child's cartoon bear was being embroidered with the sort of patience that had kept her family fed for 3 years. Kevin was curled against her side, a small weight of damp hair in sleep. Jane slept with a stuffed rabbit pressed to her face, the rabbit's sewn smile more perfect than anything in Claire's life. The twins breathed in the shallow, steady rhythm that had become her compass. Everything she did, every stitch, every late-night client call, was to keep those breaths even. A bill lay unfolded on the table, the numbers ruthless in black ink. Claire had gone through worse months, but this one felt narrower, the walls leaning in. There was the loan she had never wanted to take, an old piece of shame that lingered like a moth-eaten coat in the back of her closet, a deal made in desperation that had given them months of rent and a promise that wouldn't hold when pride came calling. She tightened the thread until her knuckles whitened, then let it slacken again. Pride, she had learned, was a delicate thing, easy to tear. She locked the door quietly as the twins woke. The morning ritual was a map. Porridge, shoes patched with duct tape, a hurried button sewn at the last minute. They left with mismatched scarves, and Claire watched them go with the same mixture of gratitude and a hunger that never left her chest. The sewing machine hummed again, and outside traffic rose like a river. The plaza outside the Rivera Gallery was crowded that evening, a glittering funnel of champagne and camera flashes for the annual charity gala, where the Torres Group was to unveil a philanthropic grant and, unofficially, display the kind of wealth that made the city tilt on its axis. Torches of light cut through fog on the red carpet. The elite brushed past red velvet ropes like royalty wandering freely. Claire had no business there, no invitation, no coat that sat right. But the city is full of places where inward luck feels like outward permission. She had been selling hand-stitched cuffs and small mending jobs within earshot of the gala for a week, hoping some spender would notice the finesse and slip a tip into her palm. That was all. No pretense, only the grit of simple survival. She almost missed the moment. It was sudden, a screech, a candle of panic. Men in tuxedos clustered, voices broken into sharp edges. A black SUV had skidded to a stop near the steps, and the man in a dark tuxedo had stumbled free, his face pale, a wet bloom at his side. People stepped back to let him breathe. Someone reached for a phone. Claire saw blood leach through silk, a stark, obscene seam of red on a white cuff. Her hands moved without asking permission, as if some other life had practiced this exact motion. She pressed both palms flat, knotting her fingers with a determination that tasted like iron. A napkin, a strip of her scarf, anything. The crowd's murmurs swelled. Someone thought to film. A camera zoomed in and caught the way her hands shook but kept constant pressure, the way she steadied the man's head with a threadbare tenderness that the wealthy around them could recognize only as an affectation. The man groaned. He was not like the gala's usual faces. This was Sean Torres. Tall, impeccably tailored, the kind of man whose presence rewired a room. He should have been a decorative certainty in that crowd. Instead, he was a cracked statue bleeding into a public fountain of flashbulbs. Claire kept her hands where they were while someone else fetched an emergency kit. In the seconds that stretched between a bystander's gasp and the arrival of paramedics, Claire felt a fierce, unfamiliar clarity. The thought that cut through the chaos was stupidly simple. If she didn't hold the wound, he might die. That would be one more life she wouldn't have saved. She had saved children whose parents could not afford stitches. She had stitched torn fabric back together and watched it look like new. The same hands, she told herself, could press a pulse back into a man with the entire city's cameras staring. Paramedics arrived and began to take control, but Claire stayed. She answered questions with the economy of the used to it. Her name, her address, why she'd been there. Voices threw hero around like confetti, and a dozen phones recorded her every syllable. She insisted she had nowhere urgent to go. Nobody believed her. A young reporter asked, "Who are you?" She wanted to say, "Someone who knows how to save," but the word that came out was softer. "Claire," she said. "Claire Moran." That night, on every feed the city owned, a frame replayed. A woman crouched beside a bleeding CEO, thread on her fingers like a badge. The captions alternated between praise and suspicion. The mayor called for the man to be stabilized. Torres's office issued a terse statement, grateful for the courage of a bystander. And Luna, crisp in a diamond brooch, posted a stiff condolence to a public feed. When the CEO's assistants finally allowed Claire past the hospital doors, it felt like being led into a cathedral. She did not sleep. The fluorescent white of the emergency room was a harsh moon under which secrets were sussed out. The man in the bed opened his eyes to monitors that made the world sound like an anxious clock. He blinked and tried to understand where the bleeding left off and where the world began again. Sean's voice, when it came, was thin with the sort of quiet that made the room breathe differently. "Can you stay?" he asked, not exactly a question. It was the kind of request that revealed more than it asked, an invitation and an admission. Claire had nowhere to go back to that night. The twins were with Mrs. Chang next door, who had a soft spot for late-night babysitters and a family pity that translated easily into oven-warm bread. "Do you want a coffee?" Claire offered, nervous fingers still stained in ghost threads. He found humor in small things. He smiled at the way she wrapped her hands when she spoke, at the fraying cuff of his own shirt. She had seen his picture 100 times, but up close, the man was both larger and entirely diminished by his fragility. And when the doctors finally wheeled him for scans, when monitors hummed and his chest rose with the mechanical attention of a hospital, Claire's eyes caught something. A sliver of fabric clung to the wound, a soft leather-laced lining more luxurious than any she could afford. She touched it with a small professional curiosity, then wrapped it in tissue like a sacred thing. In the waiting area, reporters paced, and a junior assistant with a badge named Casey hovered with a polite stiffness that came from spending decades at the kinds of tables where reputations were carved. She introduced herself like someone who had been protecting a man for 10 years and felt exhausted doing it. Her curiosity toward Claire was equal parts suspicion and strategy. "Who were you?" she asked, more practically. Claire repeated her name. She did not mention the twin birthdays, the unpaid bills, the thread count of the shirts she repaired to make rent. When Sean came fully awake, the first words he spoke were small and focused. "What is that?" He pointed to the scrap Claire had brought from his cuff. She squinted in the harsh corridor light and performed a sterile little ritual, pulling a match from her pocket because old habits survive in the pockets of those who sew, and touched flame to the edge of the scrap. The smell that rose was not of ordinary fabric. It was chemical, treated, a perfume of manufacturing that dissolves the ordinary into the engineered. Claire's mouth made a small knowing curve. "Special lining," she said. "Not from around here." Sean's eyes sharpened. "You know fabrics," Claire shrugged. "I mend for a living." He laughed then, a small sound that had the nakedness of surprise in it. "A lot of people who mend the world don't have to have their work seen," he said, as if speaking to someone who knew what it meant for a stitch to hold against time. He asked her about her hands, about the way she had tied pressure into his cuff. "You were very steady." She looked away. No one would ever see the nights she practiced on old curtains until her fingers were calloused enough to be honest. "I learned by fixing things that couldn't be replaced," she said softly. In that small admission, there was a hint of something else, a life uncloaked, yet Claire folded it back into herself. "To stay alive, you keep some things hidden," she reminded herself. The hospital stayed awake on its own after that. People drifting in, anxious relatives, a PR team arranging a tidy narrative. Torres's security debriefed Claire inside a curtained room that smelled of antiseptic. They offered her transport home and compensation, an insistence of generosity that came with the undercurrent of an offer. The city would be watching. There were stories to quiet. The idea was that a saved CEO could create a tidy, grateful hero moment if bottled and placed among the right kinds of social backdrops. But the wheels that turned around the Torres name were heavy and controlled. A single misstep could become an all-consuming headline. "Would you come to the office?" Casey asked finally. "We'd like to, thank you properly. There's paperwork, and perhaps a little compensation. And the board? Well, the board tends to get interested in those who change the course of things." Claire had no illusions. She said yes because the alternative was a night alone and a city full of dark corners. She accepted an envelope with an amount that made her breath hitch and told the children she would not be home tonight. Mrs. Chang would look after them. The twins waved with the tragic nonchalance of children who believe every goodbye is temporary. Before she left, Claire's phone buzzed with a message. It was a single line. "If you love twisty romantic dramas, stay with us." It was a stupid, impossible thing to appear in such a moment, and she almost laughed. The city had always been a stage, and for the first time, she felt like someone had noticed the exact smallness of her hands. The attendants at the hospital the next day had the quality of a procession. Sean sat wrapped in medical concern, his public face a tapestry of control and fatigue. But the way he watched Claire was not purely gratitude. There was an attention there that felt like the beginning of a map. He asked where she worked, what she did to keep her hands from forgetting their calluses, whether she saw the world in stitches and seams. He told her about a project at Torres, a coveted, risky initiative whispered about in design circles as Phoenix Rising, and how the company wanted something that could stitch the world back together with its aesthetics. He mentioned a gala, not as an invitation but as a fact of calendars. He said they needed talent, someone with an eye for threads and the bravery to use them differently. "You're a designer?" he asked before he had a chance to filter the question. Claire hesitated. She had been a designer in other lives in the city, brief flashes under the name Mina, things shown in small circles of people who loved craft over spectacle. But that life had been folded away. She had not meant to let the word leave her. It did, quiet and stubborn. "I draw. I work with fabric." Across the city, a different life unfolded with equal choreography. Luna Reed, in a dress cut like a challenge, watched the hospital coverage on her phone. She had been engaged to Sean for almost a year. Their union was a contract of interests and a tapestry woven by her mother, who read prestige like scripture. Luna's face hardened when she saw Claire on the screen. No sparkling brand, no rehearsed smile, a woman with thread on her fingers and the look of someone who wouldn't be intimidated by silk. The look translated easily into threat. In Luna's world, talent must bow to lineage, and lineage must be protected. She spun her own narrative quietly, smoothed into a voice that could sound almost reasonable. Who is she? Is she trying to step in? Luna's mother, a woman who had spent a lifetime cataloging alliances, made careful calls that later would be revealed as the first thin threads of conspiracy. "Make sure her background is known," she said to a loyalty that paid dividends. "We can't allow anyone to undermine what we've built." Claire went to the Torres building because the city had already infected her with curiosity. The headquarters were a vast glossy place where light bounced off chrome and glass like applause. Security walked her through a corridor of anonymous art until they sat in a small office with a view of the river. Flowers, expensive, unhelpful things, sat on a desk nearby. Sean watched her speak with an interest that felt less like celebrity and more like assessment. He listened to her speak about fabrics, the ways threads held and how seams betrayed stress. He asked her if she had ever considered a formal position. It was both an offer and a test. The board met the next morning and, in a pragmatic move that mixed company image management and curiosity, offered Claire short-term work, an evaluation contract attached to the Phoenix Rising concept. They framed it as a collaboration. Claire knew it would be a performance. It was also a chance to bring in money for the rent, and more importantly, to get the twins on stable ground. The offer came with conditions. She would be supervised by Casey and report to a design team that included disgruntled veterans and a celebrated mentor, Miles, who was rumored to have a soft spot for raw talent. Miles, when she finally met him, treated her like one treats an instrument, with careful, reverent examination. He watched her fingers move, the light catching in a way that made his old eyes soften. "You have a way of seeing things," he said. "Don't let anyone steal that." Not everyone was kind. Inside the design studio, the air was a complicated scent of starch and rivalries. Colleagues measured Claire as if she were a new thread to be tested. Pull until it broke or bend until it gave. Luna floated through that environment like an aristocrat in a foreign court. She had allies whose loyalties were retailed in favors and threats. When a junior designer's sketches went missing a week into Claire's work, fingers quickened to point. The rumor began beneath breath and grew teeth. Someone had found initial sketches for Phoenix Rising ripped from a portfolio and filed them as evidence of plagiarism, an accusation that tastes like acid in a world where reputation is the coin of entry. Claire moved through it all with the steadiness of someone who had performed under pressure for years. When someone slandered her, she did not scream. When a designer shoved a binder of notes off a table in front of a camera, she picked them up with the same care she used to pick up a sleeping child. "I didn't take them," she told the mounting chorus, and her voice, threaded with calm, made newsroom editors pause. But the copies of the drafts were gone, and the cameras loved a scandal more than a correction. At the same time, the twins' faces came to mean something they had never meant for Claire. Kevin and Jane, the kind of children who find clarity in the smallest truths, had been to the hospital that day and had clung to Sean with the sort of fondness only 5-year-olds can manufacture when they discover a new pattern they like. They called him Mr. Big at first, then Daddy with the casual imprecision that trips up mouths. A passing photograph of the twins clinging to the CEO spread across feeds with a speed that made Claire's stomach drop. Someone edited the caption to a whisper. "Are Sean Torres's new friends more than friends?" It was not malice, it was the slow hunger of rumor. The gossip ballooned faster than Claire could mend. Reporters called for maternity and paternity angles like they were hunting a new sensation. Torres's PR team dismissed the speculation as opportunism, but gossip has a way of making itself business. Court orders and DNA tests were discussed as if they belonged to a different life, one where law and science could be reduced to overnight verdicts. Claire refused to be photographed with the children whenever cameras prowled. She was protective in the way a person becomes when the small private things are threatened. But children blur boundaries with their affection, and Kevin had drawn a picture of their family for show and tell, with a central figure wearing a suit too big for the paper's proportions. The teacher had posted it on a private group, and the wrong person had screenshotted and posted, and a rumor had wings. When a lab finally agreed to administer preliminary DNA tests amid the clamor, an institution with less drama than the gossip yet still vulnerable to human frailty, Claire experienced the small mechanized terror of waiting. The test was a modest ceremony, a swab, a vial, a polite handoff. She had her doubts about the speed of the city's investigation, about the way a single CCTV camera could be edited into a narrative. But the thing that made the hair on her arms rise was not the technical possibility of tampering. It was that someone would consider her disposable enough to try. Sean watched the fallout from a peculiar angle. In public, he was a man agitated by the press. In private, there was a ferocity to his attention that had not existed for the names on the guest list. He had the advantage of resources, investigators, legal counsels, a team that could untangle rumor from fact. And yet, the twinned mixture of protectiveness and curiosity kept him near Claire like a shadow that refused to disperse. He found himself reading patterns in the way she breathed beneath fluorescent lights, noticing the little way she folded her hands over her chest when somebody praised her. He was not blind to the danger of the rumor. A single paternity whisper could sink careers and rewrite custody in boardrooms. Still, somewhere between the hospital and the studio, a building flushed with the smell of muslin and ambition, Sean felt unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with power. He felt like a man who had been lifted briefly out of the orbit of his own assumptions and dropped in front of an unknown horizon. Trouble came with an economy. It arrived in scheduled steps, each one predictable but devastating. At a charity banquet, Luna executed a dismissal so cold it seemed a choreography. She had arranged for a table close to the stage, an audience in delicate couture. During a speech, she raised a glass and performed a quiet, private derision that cameras love to interpret as a social shunning. She suggested, with a barbed sweetness, that philanthropy should not be a place for opportunists masquerading as heroes. The room inhaled. Flashbulbs found Claire's face. The woman who had saved the CEO, now being insinuated as an interloper. It was in that moment that a photographer's feed captured a bag falling near Claire's feet, and, in a replay of 100 movies, a bracelet sliding into the open. The social media engine did not pause. Was she planted? Did she try to steal? The narrative slid toward theft with the inevitability of gravity. Claire picked up the bracelet and held it like a thing with a story. She had never been a thief. She had stolen only from the edges of society when hunger forced currency. She presented the bracelet to security. The truth, an absent-minded pass of a drink splash from a server, did not interest the hungry viewers. The image of Luna's distaste, the bracelet in Claire's hand, the way the room turned its cheek, together created the exact stain the gossip needed. Back at the studio, someone had already been working under the cover of plausibility. A set of sketches crucial to Phoenix Rising vanished from a locked drawer an hour later, as if the city would not allow one woman to rebuild without a fight. Fingers began to point at Claire with more intensity than logic. Rumors multiplied. A woman from the wrong neighborhood, a hidden identity, a secret past. The sewing shop by the river, Claire's source of meager income and improbable pride, suddenly felt like a place that might be scrutinized. Miles watched the escalation with the dour patience of someone who had seen the machinery of fashion grind countless careers. He sided quietly with talent. "They will try to make your humility look like deceit," he told Claire one late afternoon as they measured a new prototype seam. "Don't let them define what you're capable of." His voice contained the tone of a mentor who had no illusions about the fairness of the world. He taught with an intimate coolness, instructing on a technique of using stained glass patterns in fabric, what he called aqua glass, a method that played with light and movement. Claire took to it like a fish to water. Her instinct for proportion turned the technique into something that felt like revelation. But ingredient by ingredient, the plot to discredit her thickened. Anonymous packages arrived at the studio with shredded fabric and cheap imitations of patterns she had drafted. Someone planted a video that suggested she bribed a junior staffer. Luna's mother began to whisper outside the board's meetings, an insidious counsel that gnawed at reputations slowly and thoroughly. The twins became an emotional lever used by others without a thought of the vector of fear it would cause for a mother. At kindergarten, a well-meaning mother who had a cousin in a gossip column mentioned the hospital photograph in an offhand way. Kevin, bless him, had announced to the class that his mother had helped a man in a fancy suit. When a child's version of the word daddy traveled through the internet, it grew teeth. The rumor that Sean might be the twins' father was a magnet for every opinion the city harbored. In the privacy of her tiny kitchen, Claire kissed the tops of their heads and promised that if anything happened, she would protect them. The kind of protection she imagined involved more than legal forms and money. It involved safety, privacy, a cord of ordinary life that could not be dissolved by headlines. She had no illusions about how fragile the cord could be, especially when the city's appetite for spectacle was bottomless. One night, as snow wet the city and turned the sidewalks to grey glass, Claire received a call at an hour when the city usually slept. The voice on the line was clipped, professional. "There have been irregularities in the initial paternity screen," said someone from a lab contracted by a tabloid, an organ of the city's gossiping appetite. "We need to re-swab for verification." They wanted to be thorough. They wanted to fix a mistake. Claire agreed to the retest because the alternative was a smear of her children's lives painted across pages that would never apologize. The lab appointment was a quiet thing, sterile and bureaucratic, until Claire noticed the woman in the observation room, someone with hair too carefully arranged, a bracelet too precise. The woman's eyes lingered on Claire with the dangerous interest of someone cataloging a specimen. Claire's throat tightened. She did not know why she felt like a marked animal. The technician smiled with the empty ease of a person whose profession taught them to look away from what confessions could mean. When the swab was taken, Claire left with a small sense of relief. The lab would process, a definitive line would be drawn, and the city would have to choose whether to press or to fold. What Claire did not know, what she could not possibly know, was that the lab's chain of custody had a vulnerable seam. The camera in the corridor had a blind spot. A courier with a small, efficient hand had been paid to pass by at a precise minute, and that hand had fingers that could slip a vial into an unmarked pocket. Later, under the light of unrelated inquiries, a security camera tucked behind a supply cabinet would catch the blurring image of a hooded figure, too small to name, too important to ignore. The figure would not be linked to Luna publicly that night. Trust is a slow kind of undoing. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Sean, who had been watching the swirl from his own corner of the world, began to feel the pressure of rumor not into a personal urgency. He had resources, not only for legal counters, but for immediate, decisive actions. He could order investigations, pull staff into confidential rooms, and instruct his team to find the seams where lies were stitched. He could also, if he wanted, tilt a public moment into one that calmed the city's appetite for scandal. He had done it before. Payoffs disguised as charities, carefully worded statements that split the press into manageable fragments. But this felt different. He had seen Claire under the hospital light, felt her hands steady on his wound. That memory carried an intimacy that made his chest hot and dangerous in a way he did not like to admit. Outside the studio, in the ill-lit back rooms where reputation was traded like currency, Luna's mother sat with an associate whose face was less visible than his competence. "Make sure the samples are not the same," she insisted in a voice that had been trained to ask for favors and expect compliance. "We cannot let this woman erase what we've built." That demand, merciless and precise, set a chain in motion. The people who did that kind of work, who could make a test read one way or another, are rarely the ones who ask questions about morality. They are technicians whose ethical muscle is calloused by the weight of being hired. They took the call, recorded it in a ledger that no one would ever find, and began to play the long game. The next morning, when Claire went to retrieve the preliminary results, she found a different kind of waiting. Casey met her by the studio door with a folded envelope and an apology that sounded sincere in the way polite things always do. "We're escalating things internally." The letter said the tests were inconclusive and asked for more time. Claire's heart did a small, sick lurch. She had not wanted this in public. She had wanted the truth to be a private seam. But the truth, once offered to the public, becomes a commodity, and while the world argued, the people who profit from ambiguity sold more pages. Inside a cold lab, behind a plate of glass, a technician idly scrolled through her personal feed. A message popped up on the machine. It was short. "Sample swap completed. Payment sent." Her profile flickered with a small smiley emoji and then returned to a neutral face, the kind that looks like a person who has done their day's work and gone home. Cameras in the corridor missed the small motion. The ledger recorded none of it. The city for a moment had decided that truth was less valuable than a good story. Claire, upon seeing the letter, felt the world tilt, as if a seam she trusted had begun to unravel. She thought of the twins playing on the floor with the rabbit and the bear, oblivious to the city that could seek to divide their small joys. She thought of the man whose wound she had pressed with her bare hands, and some muddled sense of loyalty and caution rose in her like a tide. She was not naive. She knew the city could be brutal, but she had a stubbornness in her that refused to be reduced to rumor. She would fight with the tools she had, her craft, her quiet. She would stand wherever she had to, with a child's picture in her pocket like a talisman. Miles watched her as she left the studio, and in his eyes something like worry shone. "People will try to write your beginning as a lie," he warned, voice low. "Don't let them edit your story." Claire walked home through streets that smelled of winter and old paper. Her phone buzzed with a single message she had not expected, a short video from someone named Security Detail. In it, a shadowed corridor moved. A hand slid a labeled vial into an unmarked pocket, the movement precise, quick. The footage was grainy, the face indistinct. But it was a milepost. Somebody somewhere had begun to stitch a story that was not hers. That night, when the twins were tucked into bed and Mrs. Chang had left for her own small apartment, Claire sat with her fingers folded on the table and considered the thinness of safety. Someone had tampered with what could decide her children's lives. The knowledge did not make her reckless, it made her sharp. She thought of the phoenix, the stubborn myth of rising from ash, and felt a private, feral hope. If a phoenix could be imagined into being for a company's brand, perhaps a woman could force her own renaissance. Across town, in a room where velvet curtains softened the sound of wealth, Sean did something he rarely did. He watched the news without a filter. The video of the lab hand played once, twice. He paused it as the figure moved, replayed the clip in slow motion, and felt, as the image blurred and the city breathed around him, the kernel of decision forming. The optics were dangerous, daily speculation, an untethered mother with children, a story that could swallow a company's carefully constructed narrative. It was not a matter that could be allowed to drift. He found himself speaking aloud in the quiet of his office. "We need to close this," he said to Casey when she arrived with a report that read like an inventory of threats. "We need to set the record straight." Casey, ever the pragmatist, laid out the options. A lawsuit, a public release, careful legal maneuvers that would take time. Sean listened, and then, like a man who had been injured and found an immediate cure in a handful of radical measures, considered an option that was quick and absolute. A public declaration, an alignment that would shift public perspective, could function as armor. It would not fix everything. Nothing could erase the facts. But it could change the terms of social engagement overnight. It could silence knives. He did not speak the words at first. To propose was to stake a claim in a way that rewritten history could not ignore. It would be a public acknowledgement that would recalibrate the city's gossip. It would not, in itself, prove paternity, but it would place the twins under a social shield the tabloids would find harder to pierce. To protect them from a storm, he considered building a wall and planting a banner on it. In his private moments, Sean had rarely allowed himself the kind of impulsive romance that television dramatized. He measured risks like other men measured investments. But something else had happened when Claire had pressed his wound, something not purely strategic. There was a tenderness that rubbed against his sense of control, a truth that felt like a seam that could be repaired only by a personal action rather than a corporate press release. He found himself imagining a future in which the twins had their nights without a stranger's pen prying into their beds. He imagined Claire moving through a world where her talent was not a bargaining chip but a vocation. But decisions like this do not exist in a vacuum. Luna had allies. Luna's mother had made calls. Ethan, who hovered like an opportunistic shadow among Torres's younger kin, had friends in low places. They had a taste for defending a legacy with the small brutality of the well-born. If Sean moved before he had evidence, if he took a measure that would scandalize high society, there would be consequences that rippled through families, contracts, and reputations. That night, with the city's glow around them and the sound of a street that did not truly sleep, Claire sat alone and considered the small, unlikely possibility of being seen. She hooked a needle and began to sew, not for rent, but as a way to quiet her hands. Fabric bled from her fingers. Her work was a small liturgy. She would, she decided, hold to a strategy that was hers. Be careful, be exact, make beauty so undeniable that those who wanted to smother it would at least have to invent a sound. Outside, the first threads of a larger scheme tightened in the hands of those who loved power more than truth. In rooms shadowed from public cameras, choices were catalogued and put into motion. The city turned and breathed. A phoenix, someone whispered in the corridors, can only rise if there is enough pain to help it remember how to fly. And as Claire pressed the final stitch into a dress that would mean everything or nothing depending on whether the city allowed her to be seen, she felt an urgency wrap around her like a cold shawl. She could not imagine the next day's headlines, but she could predict the shape of what would hurt most. Her children's names carved into gossip columns. She could not yet imagine the solution that would arrive with the force of a storm, nor could she see that a man whose life she had touched would soon consider binding their fates together in the most public of ways. She only knew that the city had discovered her, and discovery is both a blessing and a blade. A courier delivered a brown envelope an hour before dawn. Inside were photographs taken at the gala. Claire kneeling beside a bleeding man, Claire standing with the twins at his bedside, Claire holding the bracelet Luna had made a spectacle of. The back page was blank, save for 3 words written in a hand that had the clean pressure of one used to signing checks. "We are watching." Claire folded the photographs and slid them into the bottom of her sewing kit as if hiding them among bobbins and spare buttons would make them less dangerous. Her fingers trembled for a second, then steadied. Steady fingers had kept stitches from coming undone for years. She wrapped the kit in an old scarf and carried it like a talisman. She texted Casey before dawn. "Someone left these, I don't know who." The message went unsent at first. Lack of signal in the building's thin pocket of reception. Then eventually a curt reply. "Bring them in. Security will log them." No warmth, only procedure. Claire dressed the twins for kindergarten with the kind of tenderness that was almost ritual now. Kevin insisted on wearing his dinosaur sweater despite the cold. Jane braided her hair crookedly and held onto the rabbit as if it contained all answers. Claire kissed their brows and left, the photographs tucked under her skirt so they felt less exposed. The morning light on the tram was pale and indifferent. The city moved in a protective hum that made her feel like something small in a vast machine. She tried to imagine the rest of the day as a spool of possible outcomes and found she kept returning to one thread. Someone had written, "We are watching." Whoever they were, they thought surveillance was power. Claire thought of the courier clip she'd received, the shadowy hand that now felt like a name. She went to the studio because that was what she did when fear wanted to be named. Miles was there early, a mug of coffee steamy in his hands, eyebrows drawn thin as a tailor's hem. "We have a problem," he said before she could sit. He had the look of a man who had stitched 1,000 crises and still believed in finishing a seam properly. Security found these in the delivery corridor. He set down a small USB stick and a printout of a courier manifest. The video on the stick showed the same grainy figure Claire had watched. A hand, efficient and practiced, slipping a vial into an unmarked coat. The manifest listed a courier whose name matched a shell company registered quietly in the Reed family's accounts. Claire's chest tight. Someone was trying to strangle the truth with paper and money. "Who gave you this?" she asked. Miles rubbed a thumb along his lip. "An old friend at Torres who doesn't like being lied to by clients." He both wanted to protect her and to be practical about it. "We'll keep this between us for now." For hours the studio was an island of work. Claire cut and sewed with the strange concentration she always accessed when danger felt manageable if she just made something beautiful. She used the aqua glass technique Miles had shown her, thin panels of fabric that caught light like a pool, seams that resembled tiny waves. The prototype for Phoenix Rising began to look like hope, pale iridescent threads that seemed to float. When she found herself humming, it was a sound she refused to analyze. But the city had other rhythms. At noon, Casey called Claire into a meeting with Sean in a small conference room that smelled faintly of lemon and executive cologne. He sat at the head of the table as if the world could be balanced on his fingers. The photograph envelope sat between them like a loaded prop. "We found these in the delivery corridor," Casey said, and the words sounded oddly harmless in the glass box. "Someone's trying to intimidate you." Sean's gaze was quiet and precise. He touched the edge of the photograph with a finger that looked unaccustomed to dirt. "We'll increase security around your building," he said, "and we'll find where that courier came from." Claire wanted to refuse. She wanted to say, "Let me handle it, old life, old rules," but she couldn't pretend she didn't want the protection. Babies, not bills, made decisions simple. "No, the children?" she asked, voice low. Sean's hand tightened fractionally on the photograph. "We'll arrange for a school escort today, discreetly." He said it as a businessman first and a man second, but Claire saw vulnerability in the way he said it. The part of him that had been awake in a hospital bed, the part that had felt her hands on his wound. The protection was offered without a question of price, that in itself felt like currency. The day rolled into a litany of small, half-hidden measures. Casey demanded to see Claire's schedule. Miles suggested Claire move into a temporary flat on company property. Security fitted a small device into the twins' backpacks that could ping a phone in an emergency. Claire accepted some things and refused others. She invited Mrs. Chang to stay with them more nights instead of accepting the odd sterile flat in Torres Tower. Pride bent, but did not break. If anyone thought the matter solved, they were deceived. The rumor mill is not a machine easily turned off. Social feeds churned with speculation. Sisiska, hero or hired, trended for an anxious afternoon. Luna, graceful as a threat, smiled for cameras she knew would run the clip. Her posture was curated to incite. She posted a photograph of a perfectly polished engagement ring with the caption, "Soon." The city's hunger thrummed like a wire. Then the escalation happened faster than Claire wanted. That afternoon, a junior designer, a woman Claire had tried to mentor, came into the studio in a flurry, face white. "They took my son's lunchbox," she said, ridiculous in its triviality until she added the part that made Claire's skin crawl. They threatened I'd lose my job if I said anything. It was a test, small coercions to measure the response. Whoever was organizing this apparatus wanted to know whether fear could be scaled into silence. Claire found herself acting on instinct that had nothing to do with elegance. She went to the kindergarten. The room smelled of crayons and glue. Little paintings hung like torn flags. Kevin and Jane ran to her and collapsed into a tangle of limbs that made the rest of the world disappear for the fraction of a breath. The teacher, a woman with frayed patience and a kind smile, told Claire quietly that a man had asked about the children earlier that week, claiming to be from the school's maintenance crew. She had turned him away. The notion that someone could use a maintenance uniform to approach small children made Claire's bones chill. She took the twins home and set them to nap, then called Sean. He answered on the second ring, voice low and urgent. "Where are you?" "At home, with them." "I'll come by." His voice was close. Do not let anyone into the apartment." They were protective, not possessive. It mattered little that it made Claire's pride flare. It mattered that the town's predator had been signaled. She heard the shift in the city's atmosphere through the phone line, a hush of resources being reallocated, a quiet army of surveillance set in motion. When Sean arrived, he did not stand in the doorway like a man who wanted credit. He came with a van of security men and a pale, almost apologetic energy. He took one look at Kevin, and Jane curled under a blanket and softened. "You should tell me everything you remember from the day," he said, a man who had learned he needed a ledger of facts more than declarations of loyalty. Claire told him the courier clip, the bracelet, the photographs, the kindergarten visit, the retest. She did not mention the deal she carried like a moth-eaten coat. She did not confess the nights where hunger forced her into decisions she had sworn never to repeat. Secrets keep you safe sometimes, or at least they hide the parts of you that make strangers whisper. Sean listened and then went quiet. "We will get the lab footage," he said finally. "And I want you to come to the awards tonight, not under a spotlight. With me, anonymously. We'll stage it so you're safe." Claire wanted to say no. She wanted to bury herself in work and avoid the place where Luna and the cameras would congregate. But the awards were the crucible where the Phoenix Rising project would be judged publicly. Her presence could not be avoided if she hoped her work to be seen on a level that mattered. She agreed. The evening moved in the way crises always do, a series of rehearsed moves and last-minute improvisation. Sean and Claire arrived separately, Claire under a simple scarf and a coat that hid designer bias. Miles walked with her to the backstage, pressing small notes into her hand. "Do not show the aqua glass yet. Let them see the sleeve. They will notice the seam." He was more than a mentor. He was an ally who had little to gain and much to lose by intervening. That was the truest kind of loyalty. Backstage glittered with stress. Designers adjusted their own breathing as much as their gowns. Luna preened under stark lights and cruel conversations. Her mother sat in a darkened box, eyes like a ledger ready to write orders. Ethan hovered, reeds of ambition, ready to bend toward whoever promised the most return. The plan was simple. Sean would be on stage to speak briefly, Claire would be in the audience with a small piece of clothing to inspect, and security would ensure any attempt to interfere could be smothered quickly. It was a pragmatic choreography. But no choreography ever accounts for the stubbornness of human malice. At the moment the awards began, a server tripped behind the curtain. A staged accident, just clumsy enough to set cameras rolling. Then the riot started. A video feed glitched on the giant wall above the stage, and for a breath, the lights flickered as if the world had lost power. Somewhere in the wings, a man in a maintenance uniform moved quickly toward Claire's exit. Security swarmed him before he reached the door, but the image had been seen by the rows of people whose fingers were always itching for a new sensation. On the main screen, without warning, someone played a compilation. The courier footage, the lab manifest, an edited clip of Claire at the hospital, a stitched narration implying she'd staged the rescue for placement and influence. It landed like a weight in the room. Gasps fed the cameras. Luna's smile sharpened like a blade. The audience leaned forward like a flock sensing prey. Miles put a hand on Claire's back so gently she felt it like a vow. Sean rose from his seat, an unnatural stillness in him, as if he were a man who had learned the architecture of a sudden collapse. He walked to the stage with a stride that made the room hush. He spoke, voice steady. "We have footage suggesting tampering. He turned the screen off with a single movement and sat down without ceremony. Behind him, in the wings, Casey moved like a chess player, her fingers flying over a phone. She had already contacted legal counsel. She had already had a team tracing the origin of the video. But the damage is rarely in what is true, and more often in what looks true. A crowd sees an image and decides. Then the lights went out for real. Total blackout. A mechanical failure in an otherwise perfect venue. Screams and confusion braided into each other. Security floodlights threw the room into stark white. In the confusion, the maintenance man who'd been arrested at the door vanished from the camera feed for 9 seconds. That 9-second gap was enough for a sliver of panic to become a story. When the lights came back, the main screen showed something new. A live feed from a hidden camera had cut to an archival clip, one that Casey had not authorized. An old recording of a runway from years ago featuring Mina, the name the fashion world used like a myth. The footage was brief. An almost ghostly figure on the runway in a dress that rippled like water. A hand raised in a gesture that seemed almost personal. The camera lingered on the stitching at the hem, a tiny, idiosyncratic knot only Mina used. The screen froze on the hem, and people in the audience leaned forward because everyone who had ever worked in couture knows a signature when they see it. Miles felt the world tilt. He'd studied Mina's work in old magazines when the industry was kinder. He recognized the stitch as a personal cipher. "That's Mina," he said aloud. "That knot, she used it always." A murmur began that became a wave. Who was Mina? Why did the footage appear now? The question hung like a grenade. Luna's mother had meant to use Mina's name as a weapon. She had not anticipated that the weapon would be a torch that revealed hidden paths. Sean stood. He was no longer the man who measured risk purely in charts. He was someone who had been touched, and now felt an obligation that rose like hot water inside him. He turned toward Claire between them, a look that asked a question he did not yet call by name. She had the impulse to flee the glare that turned people into characters and secrets into currency. She did not. "It's her," Miles said softly, almost a confession. "Mina's technique. Where did you learn to do that?" Claire felt every eye at once like a small burn. The public's appetite is a physical thing. She could have denied. She could have become 100 plausible persons in that heartbeat. But there was weariness in her now, and something fiercer. If Mina would be a way to stop a lie, perhaps Mina's truth could mend torn things for the twins. "I trained," she said, voice small and stripped of ornament. "I worked under Miles. I was published years ago as Mina." The words dropped like a seam being cut. Someone in the audience whispered the name, another repeated it. The social feed caught the name and sent it to every hungry lens. "What she's saying is true," Miles added before Luna could spin a shape of denial. "Her hand is Mina's hand." The reaction was immediate. Luna's color shifted, the kind of pale that only privilege recognizes as shame. Cameras pivoted, and the world drank the new scent. The archival clip, now framed by Claire's admission, read differently. Not a fidelity to fame, but the story of a woman who had been hidden. The feed that had intended to smear Claire backfired. It pulled threads to a location where others had sewn fabric into a life, into a history Luna's mother had tried to bury. Faces in the crowd were a theater of surprise. The murmurs changed tone. Questions of theft were replaced by an older curiosity. Why had Mina vanished? Who had the motive to erase her? Before Claire could think about what the confession would do to the fragile scaffolding of her life, chaos erupted backstage. A man leaped from a catwalk, shouting and lunging for the screen control. In the scramble, a hand closed hard on Claire's arm. Security moved, but the assailant was fast. He dragged her through a maintenance corridor with the kind of practiced brutality that makes you wonder if the world is full of people who were paid to be cruel. Claire tried to kick, to scream, but the corridor was narrow and cameras could not capture everything. Outside the hall, Sean's teeth pressed together. He heard the disturbance like a clock. He ran. He is a man who commanded companies and numbers. In that moment, he became decidedly simple. Find and hold what mattered. He pushed through assistants, tripped over a fringe of gown, and followed the trail of alarm. Inside the corridor, Claire's heart beat the way a moth smacks at glass. The man who had grabbed her smelled faintly of oil and old smoke. He had been hired to do a job, not to question its cruelty. he slammed her into a maintenance door and searched her pockets for a phone. Claire planted her elbow into his ribs the way she'd learned to plant a needle, precise and relentless. Pain shot up her arm, but the man staggered, and she found the small pocket of courage she always kept tucked away. She reached for a pipe and struck blindly. The world became a sequence of sensations. The clank, the metallic scream of a door opening, a shout. Sean arrived as if a god had finally entered a room. He saw the assailant raise his hand, and he moved like a man whose body had learned to protect. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, a sharp breath of violence that wasn't theatrical. Security flooded the corridor then, a tide of uniforms and badges. The assailant was wrestled down and cuffed. Claire stood panting, clothing disarranged, but whole. Her hands were raw from the scuffle, threads of fabric scudding across the concrete floor like tiny white flags. Sean's voice when he found her was almost unexpectedly tender. "Are you all right?" he asked, as if the answer mattered more than the rescue. Claire's laugh was a small, incredulous thing that held no victory. "Yes." He should have left it there. He could have called for questions, for statements, for a procedural apology. But something inside him tightened. He was not a man given to impulsive vows. He was the architect of carefully considered moves. Yet when the city and the press and Luna and her mother and 1,000 hungry fingers wanted to rewrite a woman as a villain, he found himself wanting to do something that cut through the public narrative like white cloth through dark fabric. At first, his plan was cynical, a public announcement of protection, a statement. But the plan hardened into one single clearly visible action. The kind that cannot be massaged into anything else. Marriage. Not a legal maneuver alone, though it would have legal impact, but a public, undeniable claim. He would not explain it to the board as strategy and leave it at that. He would make it visible, raw, and hard to argue with. Backstage, as Claire patched a bruise she had no time to dress, Sean's decision made a path in his chest. He called Casey and the legal team and told them what he intended. "It's fast," he said, voice clipped. "I know, but it will make the narrative different." They argued. Lawyers enumerated consequences and cautions and the time law required. Board members protested in whispers that cut like pins. Lara Reed made a face that looked like someone who had been told the floor would fold under her shoes. But the optics would be immediate. The social process would rewind, and the proposal would create a new story, one the tabloids would find harder to chew through. That night at an after-party, Sean took Claire aside and spoke. His words were simple and startling. "I'm going to propose," he said. "Tomorrow, not because of what the tests say, I want to know that, but because of what I saw when you sat with my hand wrapped in yours while the blood kept coming. Because those children are not collateral to me, because I will not let them be used to hurt you." Claire felt the world constrict to the space between his palms. She was not a naive woman. She knew the social power marriage could wield. She also knew it could become a gilded cage if misused. "What about how I feel?" she asked. It was not a rhetorical question. She wanted a truth that was neither merciful nor patronizing. Sean's look answered, "I don't know what the future will be, but I want to build it with you in it. If it's not enough, if this is not enough for you, then we will face that truth together. But tonight the simpler thing is to protect your children, to stop the machine." There were moments where Claire imagined herself younger and softer, the girl who offered kisses and for whom the world sometimes had loopholes of mercy. In that instant she thought of Kevin and Jane, of how small their lives could be when written by other people. She thought of the man whose body she'd held under a fountain of flashbulbs. She thought of Miles' quiet prayers that talent be recognized on merit. And then she realized she was tired of being the subject of other people's narratives. "All right," she said finally. Not surrender, not capitulation, a decision with her eyes wide open. The next morning, the world behaved like an animal prodded into attention. The board issued a bland statement about standing behind the company's commitment to safety and fairness. Luna's mother called meetings and composed statements like weapons. But the city's feed had been cut. Instead of the old smear stories, people woke to a photograph of Claire and Sean walking into a registrar's office with the twins at their sides. Kevin's hand in Sean's, Jane's rabbit tucked under Claire's arm. The caption read, "Torres and Moran, engaged to wed." The phrase was terse and sweet like a ribbon. Public response was seismic. Editors who had wanted to poke at Claire's past found themselves reframing. The story of a man who had used his status to protect a woman rather than expose her for profit was a salve that sold just as well. Luna's smugness fractured under the weight of the new narrative. Board members who had wanted a sanitized statement now had to pivot to damage control. The optics of attacking a woman who had been publicly engaged to the CEO would be scandalous, reputationally catastrophic. The marriage did what Sean had hoped. It reoriented conversation. But it did more than that. The new narrative allowed for cooperative investigations. With Luna's allies exposed to new scrutiny, Casey and Sean launched a concerted effort to follow the chain of the tampered lab results. They subpoenaed the courier manifest and traced the shell company to a U.S. mailbox. They pulled security footage from the fabrication plant where the lining that had been in Sean's cuff was produced. They found a signature stitch, a supplier who remembered Mina's orders and saved an old ledger. The threads of the conspiracy tugged like a net being hauled up. A key break came when the company's investigators found the delivery van used that night had been registered, months earlier, under a lease paid for by an associate of Luna's mother. The associate's phone pinged a GPS in the moments when the vial exchanged hands. Under pressure, a courier confessed. He had been paid in cash to make the swap by a woman who left a receipt for a dry cleaning bill as cover. The woman's face on the security footage was grainy, but the blouse she wore had an embroidered insignia, a stylized shell that the investigators traced to a boutique that preferred clients with discreet taste. The boutique was a known stop for Reed family purchases. Under interrogation, one technician at the lab cracked. Evidence coaxed him into truth. He had been offered a payment and had switched the sample in a blind moment for a man with a face the size of the back of a van. He had not thought of consequences beyond the small thrill of cash. His confession put the final combustible piece on the Reed family's intent. The truth unfolded in the public square like an embroidered reveal. Luna's mother's calls were traced. A ledger showed payments to the lab technician and the courier. Luna's face, when the arrest warrants were presented, was a book of theater stripped of its script. The city loved justice when it came with the satisfying click of a lock. Luna was barred from the company and face-plastered in feeds with captions that tasted like schadenfreude. Her mother, the architect of whispered lies, was named in an affidavit that made the tabloids coil with vicious delight. But the revelation that most shook the room was not the arrests. It was the lab's corrected test. When investigators seized the original vials and matched the twins' preserved neonatal blood spots, kept by the hospital under custody for checks, the definitive analysis showed a paternity match. The twins shared genetic markers with Sean. The result was the kind of quiet thunder that makes private rooms snort like startled beasts. It explained motives and explained why someone might be willing to go to obscene lengths to cut a woman down. The implication that the twins might be Sean's children changed everything on a human level. The scandal was no longer simply about reputation, but about family history, denial, and attempts to erase inconvenient truths. Sean's face on the morning the results were confirmed had an odd translucence to it. He looked at Claire as if the information were a rope and she had climbed down it into his life. The proof did not erase the possibility of hurt in either of their pasts, but it offered a new axis of responsibility. He did not approach the news as a conqueror. He approached it as someone both stunned and altered. Legal teams met. Papers signed themselves into motion. For Claire, the paternity result was a strange justice. It meant the children were not the instruments of rumor, but part of a hidden truth that someone had tried to smother. But it also complicated her sense of identity. If Mina had once been intimate with Sean in some other life, then a secret existed not only about her career, but about choices she had made that had consequences. She and Sean held a private conversation in a small office that smelled of lemon and iron. They did not rehearse a future so much as feel for the shape of it. "I'm sorry for everything you've been through," he said, as if apology could stitch an old seam. "I don't know why I left. I don't know how different it would be if I had known sooner." Claire heard the doubt in his voice and also the earnestness. She had winters of hunger. He had winters of choices. Neither had the moral authority to demand perfection, only the responsibility to act now. "We both did things," she said. "But now the children are here. They are not the sum of our mistakes." The legalities of custody and recognition took their usual time to translate into papers, but the social shield of the engagement held. The public's curiosity had found a new appetite for romance instead of scandal, if only for a breath. Torres Group, shaken by the proximate risk of reputational harm, offered Claire a position with real authority, chief designer assigned to Phoenix Rising with a seat on the project board. The proposal had not been a simple lever of protection, it had rapidly remapped power within the company. The board voted, under the glare of public confidence, for the promotion as both a practical move and a symbolic one. The Golden Feather Awards, where Mina had been revealed on a thread of footage and spun into public conversation, became the theater for the ultimate blow. On stage, where the city liked to see its symbols crucified or crowned, Sean took the microphone and spoke with a voice that had the steady of someone who had decided to be both leader and lover in one breath. He spoke of being grateful to Claire, of being stunned by the courage she had shown, of the children who had taught him a new language of care. And then, in a moment that felt calculated and intimate in equal measure, he did what changed everything on the spot. He asked Claire to stand in front of him as everyone watched. Her name, Claire Moran, echoed down a corridor of lights. Cameras leaned in. He took her hand and said, "Marry me." It was not a question that could be reduced to optics alone. The proposal was fast, next day in the brutal, compressed way the world now demanded, but it carried the now incalculable gravity of a man who had found paternity confirmed and decided to anchor his life publicly. He framed it both as protection and commitment. "I will stand up for you and our children. I will sign the papers that give them a name in the world. I will do the things fathers do even if my past mistakes make that strange." Claire's answer was not immediate. She felt the press watching like a different breed of insects, the cameras hungry for the shape of her refusal or acceptance. She thought of the children, and of the night she had held a man's pulse beneath floodlights and felt a tenderness that had nothing to do with ambition. She also thought of a mother's love, how it compels you to make practical choices even when your heart keeps a private ledger. She nodded. It was small, almost private, and the applause that followed felt enormous. Luna's mother watched as if struck. The high tables that had once felt like islands of certainty now stood in shifting water. For the tabloids, the story became a romance again, and romance sells in ways vindication sometimes cannot. But the marriage was not a cure-all. Legal consequences cascaded. The Reed family faced financial penalties for the tampering. The lab technicians were fined and sentenced for falsification and obstruction. And the courier admitted in testimony to having taken money to move evidence. The world would still talk for months. The people who had been used as instruments, junior designers, gossip columnists, would face their own reckonings. Luna and her mother were banned from corporate boards and faced civil suits. Ethan, who had hovered like opportunism personified, found his chance at power shuttered. Claire's promotion was real. Phoenix Rising shifted under her name in the credits. The first design she released as chief designer bore the aqua glass seam and the signature Mina knot, turned now into a conscious motif that made critics praise the authenticity of the line. The project became something more than corporate salvage. It became a manifesto about craftsmanship unmoored from pedigree. Life settled into a new complicated rhythm. The marriage was fast, but not a fairy tale. There were awkward dinners and tense discussions about public image and private grief. The twins slept nights with a sort of bright bewilderment. Kevin called Sean daddy without needing explanation, and Jane kept the rabbit near, as if it had always known more than adults. Claire moved into a modest suite in a company-owned property until she found a place that felt like a home again. They purchased it together. An old townhouse near the river that used to be too expensive to imagine. Sean signed checks and papers and legal statements with a seriousness that made Claire's head spin. He did not romantically decide everything for her. The marriage was public armor and private negotiation. There were rows, and there were quiet, honest conversations. Sean asked Claire again and again what she wanted, and she answered sometimes in raw practicalities, childcare schedules, mentorship programs for the studio, and sometimes in small, tender requests. Learn my mother's recipes, call if you'll be late. They navigated policy and tenderness together, and somewhere between board meetings and school pickups, an odd affection took root like a seam mended to fit. Miles watched the transformation with the kind of satisfaction mentors keep in their chests. "You used the loom of your life to weave something that suits you," he said when he came to measure a new sample. Claire laughed then, the sound free enough to feel like a stitch finally tied. Months later, when the Phoenix Rising collection debuted and the press turned its small, sharp gaze onto what talent could make from truth, critics used words like rebirth and audacity. The clothes were praised, not because scandal had taught people to look kindly, but because the garments themselves held a courage, designed by a woman who had never let talent be a whisper. Luna and her mother faded into the margin of society where scorn occasionally visited. They had all the resources that money could buy, but the city had no patience left for people who tried to buy reality. They attended hearings and issued statements of regret, which read like apologetic receipts. Claire kept a small box in a drawer where she kept the bracelet that had once been planted near her at the banquet. It felt ridiculous to keep it, an object that had nearly undone her life, but it reminded her that objects could be transformed. Once a weapon, then a clue, and now a memento of what she had weathered. She sewed tiny motifs into the hems of the children's clothes as if to stitch into their days a quiet history of resilience. Kevin and Jane learned to tell a different story about how they came to be seen, that their mother had saved a life, and that life had chosen to be part of theirs. Publicly, the marriage shifted power structures. The board quietly restructured contracts to prevent a repeat of the kind of manipulation Luna had attempted. Community programs for seamstresses and design apprentices gained funding through the Phoenix Rising philanthropic arm, and Claire insisted the money go to the neighborhoods that had taught her to work with thread and hunger. She used her voice in small, measured ways: mentorships, training programs, scholarships, every action a seam that closed a small wound. When the twins were older and asked in blunt, honest ways about their beginnings, Claire told them in a way that was true without being raw. "There are things about adults that are messy," she said, smoothing a strand of hair from Kevin's forehead. "What matters is this: you're loved, you are held, we are a family." Sean listened and added jokes and bumbling moments that made the children laugh and sometimes cry in a good way. In a quieter closing of the arc, Claire went back to the Rivera Plaza where she had first pressed a pulse into the world. The fountain was less crowded now. The city had settled into its new chapters. She sat on a bench with a cup of cheap coffee and watched people pass, fast as seams on a hem. The city was still hungry and sometimes cruel, but it had also shown the strange humility of being redirected. Sean joined her after a board meeting, briefcase in hand, and sat down without a fanfare. He placed his hand over hers and squeezed. There were no grand speeches. The proposal had already happened and been reminted into the ordinary work of being a family. "You ever think about going back to Mina?" he asked quietly. Claire smiled, an expression that carried both past and future. "Mina is part of me," she said. "But she doesn't have to be a secret anymore." He looked at her the way a man looks at a seam he intends to keep forever, carefully, with respect. "Good," he said. "I like the way you make things hold." They sat together as the winter sun threw long stitches across the plaza, watching strangers weave their own small acts. Around them, high society had been shaken and rearranged by one small, deliberate rescue and the public ripples it made. A poor girl had pressed life into a man's chest, and in doing so, had rewritten the ledger of a city that once thought it could buy truth. The proposal had shocked a world that loved spectacle. The marriage had provided a shield. But beyond strategy, something more ordinary had happened. Two people, imperfect and culpable in their own private ways, chose to be responsible for each other and for the small people who now called them family. Claire took Kevin's hand when he woke from his nap and Jane's when she toddled in, and showed them a dress she had sewn that morning with an aqua glass hem and a tiny knot of Mina's signature. It was not grand, just a small, beautiful thing that fit the children like a promise. They spun in the living room, laughing, and for a time the world contracted to the size of their joy. The city would continue to gossip and to publish sharp-edged headlines. There would be future scandals and future tests of loyalty. But for now, the fold had been closed. The Reed family's plot had been unraveled. The Phoenix Rising project, once a board's gamble, became a genuine symbol. An industry reborn by someone who had known what it meant to stitch survival together by hand. When the award season was over and the critics had exhausted their adjectives, Claire and Sean hosted a small dinner for the studio. Miles, Casey, a few junior designers, and the twins who ate more spaghetti than was socially acceptable. They toasted to work and to truth and to small, honest things. The way thread holds a seam, the way apologies sometimes come late but with intent, the way protection can be love when it is given without calculation. Later, when the house was quiet and the twins slept, Claire stood by the window looking at the dark river. She felt the exhaustion of someone who had been through storms and come out with pockets of light. She thought of the envelope that had started it all, of the cruel hand that had placed a bracelet near her at a banquet, and of the small, decisive act of keeping a stranger's life for a night. That act had changed everything. A message came through on her phone, a single line from a follower who had watched the public drama unfold. "Thank you for being brave." Claire smiled, an honest private smile that was more unburdened than proud. She replied with a simple heart emoji and closed the phone. In the weeks that followed, more than one young designer showed up at the studio with thread in their hair and dreams in their pockets. They had heard of Mina now, of Claire, and they wanted work, mentorship, a chance. Claire welcomed them because she remembered what it felt like to be invisible. She taught them the aqua glass, the small knot, the way a seam can hold a life together if you sew it with patience. High society, for its part, learned that a single public act could break its tightest expectations. The next time the elite gathered to judge someone, they found themselves a little less sure of their own moral high ground. It did not ruin them, money rarely dies, but it made them pause. Other women found small openings where before there had only been polished doors, and in quieter corners, where things are rebuilt slowly, Claire sewed a strip of fabric into the inside of each phoenix rising coat, a tiny hand-stitched knot. It was there as a secret brand, a maker's mark that meant a seam had been made honestly. People who bought the coat asked little about how it came to be. Some imagined romance, others assumed it was public relations. But a few, those who had a small hunger for truth, would feel the hem and know this was made by someone who had learned to hold things together when the rest of the world wanted to pull them apart. When the story settled into books and feeds and quiet recollection, the headline that had once declared scandal became, for many, a different story. A poor girl saved a billionaire CEO. His next-day proposal shattered high society. The words had once sounded like tabloid flair. With time they read more like an observation, that sometimes a single brave act can expose lies, break systems, and remake power in a way that leaves a city better for it. The headline did not contain the whole truth. No headline ever does, but it held enough of one to make change possible. Claire slept that night with the ribbon she had used to tie the twins' hair tucked under her pillow. In the morning she would wake, sew a new hem, meet with Miles about the next prototype, and take the children to school. The world would keep turning. For now, she let herself rest in a truth she had earned, that she had saved a life, that the man she had saved had chosen, quickly, impractically, with a mix of duty and something like love, to bind their fortunes, and that in doing so the small things that mattered most, the children, the craft, the honest work, had been protected. If you like this story and want more twisty romantic dramas with high stakes and couture, subscribe for more tales like this.